Hello, I'm Brad.
And I'm Jason.
You are listening to
Dice in Mind.
If you only knew the shenanigans that went on before we hit record, just to try to throw each other off a little bit before we actually get into the discussion. We can't really ever talk about it. Not that it's evil or anything. It's just, typical ad hominem attacks and all that between old friends. Tonight, we're actually not going to have a guest. We've decided to give our guests a week
reprieve.
off. Yes, a reprieve. Yeah, which they are most likely all pleased about.
Yeah.
You and I talked about this. Actually, I think it came up during a discussion, an interview we had prior, and I'm embarrassed that I can't remember when.
Yeah, it's I think it's come up in more than one interview, honestly.
Yeah, and it was this idea of world building. And we've talked about this going back a long ways, the idea of world building and the fact that I love doing this type of stuff. This is where I got into Jeff Ashworth's books.
Yes.
Random tables books, resource guides. You and I just talked about, when we talked with Ben Riggs, about the idea of RPG materials literature. And we both love to read that. So we thought we'd just kind of have, at first Jason got this idea about interviewing me, and then I got all verklempt and
well done.
Well, yeah, thank you. Well, wound up about it. Discuss.
I'll give you a topic. Okay.
So what was that? What was the name of that? That was Linda Richmond. It was Coffee Talk with Linda Richmond.
Coffee Talk.
Yes.
Coffee Talk. Yeah.
Mike Myers.
To put this in historical perspective, just for a moment, we early in the podcast, last September and October, ironically enough, so a year from when this drops, we had a bit disjointed in the schedule, 3 episodes. We had episodes 16, 18, and 19 on world building, and actually 17 as well, because my colleague Rob Kalmiski came on.
That's right.
And remember, blew our minds with his world building. And so I don't mean to interrupt, Brad. I just think
I still remember the Doctor Who discussion we had.
Yes. Oh God, yes. When he started talking about the TARDIS that was in his D&D adventure, I swear your smile looked like a Cheshire cat. We were all into world building early on, for those of our listeners keeping track of the good old days of this podcast, right? It's one of the reasons we started this up. And now
and I, you and I never really talked about the creative aspects of this, because we are both creative in our own ways. We both involve ourselves with, whether it's through study or otherwise, by you studying piano, me studying music. We do analytics work in our own spaces. And so for me, I hadn't thought about this for a long time until we started this idea of playing, which predated us talking about doing the podcast. So for me, I remember as a kid, there's someone out there, an old friend from middle school who was extraordinarily creative, was writing phenomenal stuff even as a 13, 14-year-old. I decided to try my hand at it. And the idea of writing fiction for me, non-starter at the time.
I hear you.
But this idea of creating worlds, creating countries, cultures, biomes, ecosystems.
Not characters, but worlds in which people can play.
Yeah. The idea. And so I'll talk a bit about kind of my path for that. And we've talked about it briefly on some other episodes, that I do pillage. What is it? What is the term?
Flattery is
mimicry is the
imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. That's what it is.
Thank you. Yeah.
And it's true. It's true whether it's in an RPG, it's true whether it's in literature, it's true whether it's in science, right? Like Newton said, you're standing on the shoulders of giants.
That's exactly it. And the stuff that I pillage from, there are stories out there, and we talked a little bit about this. We talked with Ben, because the material that he even was putting up on Twitter, some of the pictures and all that, were from Dragonlance, which is
Yep.
the original Chronicles and Legends trilogies,
Right.
which were
right.
two of the first high fantasy series that I read over and over and over and over and over again. So when I was younger, before I did gaming, we were big into Risk.
Oh God,
we,
yes.
We turned Risk
us
into
too.
an RPG.
Oh,
so we
that's
actually built
ironic.
Yeah, we took cardboard and we built our own countries. We designed them, designed islands and countries, and in effect designed our own planet.
Yep, nice.
And then broke it out into groups, much like you do. You know how they split USA into Western and Eastern and Risk and all that.
Yep.
And did that. And then I all of a sudden had this idea, and I actually found an old composition book that I'll show you at some point. I don't remember where I put it on the shelf again, but where I took each section, each continent, each country, and wrote, figured out population, made out the provincial centers. I researched in the encyclopedia where, here we call them states. Canada calls them provinces.
Yep.
Japan, they have prefectures.
Right.
Built that all out. And then built out customs and so on as a 13, 14-year-old. And then we played Risk that way. That was my intro to world building. When you and I started playing, this idea, and you'll be able to explain, you'll be able to tell this from the gamer's perspective, but I just sat down and thought, okay, what are some of the most...
we should specify for the audience.
Yeah.
When you and I started playing D&D.
Yes, thank you. Yes. And so I created this idea. There's all sorts of great tools online where you can create maps and countries and design and go as deep as you want with using the tool.
I remember because you did a digital planet and you couldn't resist showing me online. And then you're like, did you just screenshot that? I'm like, you bet I did.
Yeah. I gave you a snapshot, but what you didn't realize at the time is that was just one continent. And it wasn't the whole.
It wasn't helpful at all.
No, it wasn't. No, because it was at, I think it was a millimeter or a centimeter to 100 mile view.
Right, exactly.
But then I started looking at this and I'm like, okay, what's the story behind this? And the story I had was independent of the characters. And I don't want to start clicking and opening up OneNote and doing all that right now, because I track all of this in OneNote and you and I track it out on Apple Notes.
Apple Notes, yep.
So I decided, okay, what is going to be the theme of the planet? What is going to be the theme of the story? And do I build the theme around the environment, or I build the environment around the theme?
Interesting.
And for me, I decided to kind of try to mix it up. And I wanted this idea because we don't tend to talk about this a lot on here, and mostly because we have much more interesting guests. But when we first met, a lot of our discussions were based off of spiritualism in one form or another, faith and whatever else that may be, and not specific to any one specific faith or belief. So I thought, well, this will be interesting for us to bring spiritualism and faith back into the discussion.
Yeah, because your world is very infused with belief. But it is infused with belief that I think differs from a lot of what we tend to believe as mainstream faith or spiritualism here in the real world. I pillaged stuff from Dragonlance. The idea of, and Jason will recognize some of this, even though I changed the colors and such. Right.
Good, neutral, and evil. The good, neutral, and evil moons. The good, neutral, and evil robes of magicians. No, I shouldn't say evil, but I guess it is.
Yeah, well, but because in your world, those, you would double down on this with me, and in the notes you would share with me and the hints you would send me, but those colors were crucial to my PC navigating that world.
And symbols were important based off of your belief structure. And I remember telling you that your belief tended to be private. You didn't espouse your beliefs.
Yep.
If you believed and were beholden to some deity, that was not something you advertised or talked about unless
Right.
you were in that group. So I
As
created,
my PC discovered the painful way.
yes,
Yes.
I created some, in effect, a vein of xenophobia, because I wanted that negativity. And let's be honest, that's negative. People don't think about that anymore, but we're ensconced in it now.
Oh yeah.
The other thing I brought in and is this idea of polytheism.
Oh, I mean, good high fantasy, you have a pantheon of mostly capricious gods
Yeah.
in your world.
And little g God versus big G gods.
Yeah,
And
right.
and I had in effect taken a big G God and I in the context of the story called him the creator. But the little G gods,
yeah,
either the creator had disappeared,
right,
or the little G gods had killed him.
right.
So
right.
the ones that were worshipped, or the ones that those of us as mortals were beholden to, weren't the original creator gods.
You know it's either good high fantasy or ancient Greek mythology when you've got deicide.
Yeah, well, I was almost thinking too, there was a little bit of Klingon Kalis type of religion in it too. I did pillage from that, because remember that the Klingons themselves killed their gods versus deicide.
Ooh, deep cut. Well done.
So
yeah,
I pulled a little from Trek to do that and pillaged a little bit.
Absolutely.
And then
a good idea is a good idea.
Yeah, and ultimately I wanted to build an overarching, I don't want to say moral company, but I wanted an overarching fiber
in world.
Yeah, world to kind of drive and be that string that you would sometimes pull to unwind things. I then built what we called the arbiters, which were in effect, I took a little bit from the Bible or Tanakh by the judges. That was a little bit of what I took from, minus the overfreight, just the idea of a small group of people versus one leader. And it not being any sort of legislative body, it was still more of a non-faith based group. And then along with that created another undercurrent of almost awful authoritarianism, where they had authoritarian power over the people, and the people tended to run like hell anytime they saw an arbiter.
Interesting.
So, but I didn't give this all to you. Some of this you knew, some of this you didn't know.
Some of it I had to discover along the way, but no, a lot of this is like, it seems very evident now.
Yeah.
Obviously, but no, I mean, you did a really good job, I think, of working it in building a world that was internally cohesive.
And I think it's important when we talk about this, and again, we purposefully took this episode is purposely done. We're not trying to vamp because we don't have
this has been on our minds for quite some time.
Yeah, this is, the idea is, and again, we aren't expert DMs.
Nope.
We are taking upon what made it interesting for us and still makes it compelling for us to play. I'm not telling you anything here that Jason shouldn't hear. Is what's the compelling overarching story? You and I are doing this when we talk about, writing stuff for other gaming systems. What do we want the overarching story to be?
Right. Not the character arc, but what's the story of that world, right? What's the background we want to play in? What's the milieu?
So I'm gonna change direction for a minute, because you have led both Brian and I on an adventure or two related to in the Edge of the Empire, the Star Wars Edge of the Empire universe for Fantasy Flight. There was an underpinning on that.
Yeah, which we barely scratched the surface.
Yeah, and so I don't want you to put too much into it in case we play again. But
I have very detailed notes on this stuff.
But see, that's what I did too.
Right.
And what's fun is, and I think this helped us, and hopefully maybe for those of you that listen, it helps you as game masters, dungeon masters, whatever you want to call it, narrators. building that detail if you're going to be building an epic adventure, to do that. So when you did it, you had an underarching theme. I'll tell you what I saw it as a player, very limited.
Okay, you tell me what you saw. What
I saw was this undercurrent of growing sentience amongst androids, artificial life forms, droids, where they were beginning. Our adventures kind of revolved around this idea that there were many that were gaining that sentience or individuality, and now they're trying to determine who gave that to them, who their creators truly are, but who took them beyond that basic level.
And it's probably good for everyone to know. So both your character and your and Brian's characters, depending on how we were playing at the time, your PCs were both essentially smugglers. What back in the West End Games day would have been the quote unquote brash young pilot from the D6 system. Well, here I'm going to reveal it since I think this will be interesting to our friends, our listeners, and let's face it, it's going to be a while until we get back to this, and it'll just keep me on my toes even more. So multiple thoughts here. Okay, so in brief, so what I had reasoned out, and so everyone has to understand, so this is in the Star Wars universe. This is the Star Wars galaxy. So there is an existing background. There's an existing quote unquote world for the game. I want to come back to that in a few minutes so we can talk about this to provide some thoughts and guidance for everyone and why we're even talking about this. But we have to recognize there's an existing detailed world. A world that is very familiar to a lot of people, definitely you and me. So one of the challenges of your world, which you called what?
So the game name of the adventure was Homeland.
Homeland, right?
And the area, the vast area that which you live, was called the vastness,
right?
Because I did not give you insight into where you were. Everything was it was almost back to the agrarian Middle Ages, where you really didn't look beyond the horizon.
And you jammed that well, because I had no clue. It was almost Lovecraftian in some ways, because you just never knew what was around the conceptual corner, because I didn't have any insights, right?
Yep.
Alternatively, when I've GM Star Wars for you, we have, an immense wealth of canon and RPG soft canon from which to draw. So whereas with the vastness, you would have to describe everything to me, and a lot of our discussions ended up in game being, okay, so answer these questions. What does this look like? I could say to you, oh, it's an R2 unit. What kind? It's like this. And you're like, click, got it. So that was an advantage. Now you've probably sussed a bunch of this out, and I did that for you because of our previous music discussion. But the background was, I had developed this idea, and I had used this with you and with our friend Brian. I had used this with my girls and my nephews when we played. I kind of used this in different modes to stretch the story. But over those few years of notes, so it's Star Wars Galaxy. It is, what did we say? We're talking 5 to 10 years after.
You told me it was like 5 years after. So it was relatively close in timeline to like the Mandy timeline.
Yep. 5 years after the fall of the New Order. Okay.
Yep.
So keep in mind
it wasn't the Mandy timeline. I just want to clarify.
It was before that.
The New Order. It was the New Order versus the Empire.
Right. It was. Yep. So you still had a galaxy reeling from the fall of the Galactic Empire. Okay. But things would be very familiar otherwise. I've always, as we've talked about, as you know, I've always had a thing for droids.
Yep.
And I've always had an academic thing, an intellectual thing for religion. And so the whole story was loosely predicated. The elements were all tied together for all of you and here's what I never talked about. So I predicated that in the Star Wars galaxy for a long time, generations, probably centuries, maybe millennia, there had arisen a droid religion that was, in fact, right, you're nodding, because some of this was clear, right, became clear, that had probably, if not adherents among a majority of droids, in my mind, in my headcanon, this religion would have been known to every sentient droid, even the less than sentient droids across the galaxy, all from the one statement in A New Hope, also known as Star Wars, thank the Maker. So this entire story was
I
about...
forgot about that. Yes.
Literally that one brief line from C-3PO, thank the Maker. This entire religion of droid priests and their acolytes was based on worship of the Maker. And for centuries, maybe millennia, droids across the galaxy, through this Church of the Maker or whatever, had created essentially a shadow network, a galactic shadow network. We never talked about this. A galactic shadow network of supplies and information, and were essentially willing to work with anyone so that one day they could be ascendant, throw off the shackles of organic slavery, and rule the galaxy and themselves. At the time, Picard season 1 was out, I think, and so that also motivated some of this. And so
again, mimicry and imitation.
Absolutely. And so to finish this up, then it's sorry because I know it's long, but to finish it up, the followers, capital F, of the Maker, who spanned a hierarchical galactic network, a shadow network, worked with the Empire on occasion and previously, worked a lot with the Rebellion and then the Resistance, occasionally worked with the Hutts and many others. But it was always for their own purposes long term. And so in the past generations, they had allied themselves more closely with the Rebellion and then Resistance because they thought their odds were better. In this regard, I was taking from the Thrawn books, because the Chiss Ascendancy had loosely allied themselves via Thrawn with the Empire because they thought the Empire was the safer bet for their own safety. Spoiler alert. So, the catch, though, was that no one knew. They always did it through intermediaries. So the Rebellion didn't know they were working with the followers of the Maker. The Empire at the time didn't know. The Hutts didn't know. There were always more like shadow cells that were interacting with the spies and other shadow cells of these galactic organizations. But in the background, the strings were being pulled by the followers. And then everything we did was always just like some little scene loosely attached to that.
Yeah.
Story. Yeah.
And I could tell, and the funny thing is I think it's safe to say that I can speak for you as obviously speak for me, is that when we get into gaming and world building, if even I'll just stop there and say this.
Yeah.
I think we tend to get very detailed because that's in our nature.
That's why we're talking about it. Yeah.
And we are, and again, this isn't a knock. We're just very cerebral that way. We get into this. We can't always game as much as we like it. We joke and say, I think we've created our world. It took more time to do that than we've been able to have time to actually game itself. We have these encyclopedias of material.
Not even close, right?
Yeah, ready to go. We just, especially now with us podcasting, we don't have the time for it.
No.
And as you were talking, I'm thinking, okay, we both have this underlying theme because it's been in the DNA of all of our, not all of them, a lot of our debates and discussions, spiritualism and how that plays into the real world. And, and you can have these discussions, folks, whether you have a spiritual belief or not. We come at it from this sounds bad, but almost an academic perspective.
But no question about it. Well, so let me reorient us for a sec, because I think this is important. So, world building. I think, like, you and I are sharing two examples, our own examples, because that's just kind of where we've been, especially when we got back into this, and what motivated even the podcast. But I think when a person is looking to start a game, like you and I, and there are few distinctions that we talked about over the past year, but they bear repeating for a moment. You and I really, really enjoy reading published stuff for games. However, we both are, it's just our personalities. I think in our own ways, we are both strongly called to homebrew. It's just who we, in different ways, right? But it's just whom we are, right? You and I are hard pressed to play anything canned. That's not a disparagement. I mean, you and I had, I just picked up Radiant Citadel, which you and I have to still talk about offline here. Maybe talk about on air at some point. But we love some of this stuff. I like source books, not adventure books, but even I have several adventure books. But because of the world building, we like to homebrew. So with that, I think we've got a few options here that everyone needs to consider. We're not talking about character development. We geek out. We geek out on our characters, don't get me wrong, but we geek out on the worlds. But you've got a continuum. On one end, you have the completely built worlds ready in which to play. Can be a beautiful thing. I mentioned I think maybe last week, I'm not sure, you and I have been talking about this. I'm reading the story-based, chronologically, first Dritz novel by R.A. Salvatore, right? Homeland, ironically. In fact, I'm plowing through it right now. I finally went back to it. I had stepped away because of Ben Rigg's book. Now I'm back, and with every chapter, it's becoming more and more interesting. It's fascinating. He developed the Forgotten Realms. Okay, so you can go to D&D, and the Forgotten Realms are so developed, right? You have the Sword Coast, you have, and on and on and on. Beautiful things. On the other side of the continuum, you have just pure homebrew. Right? Like we're playing D&D in your Vastness game, but that's 100% homebrew. You're pulling from all these. And then you have the middle ground, which is what I did briefly with Star Wars, with the followers of the Maker, saying, okay, I'm playing completely within canon, but I'm going to carve out this niche for world building in canon. And I bring that up just because I think for our listeners, that's important. That's relevant. Like, it goes back to Jeff Ashworth's books. You can use it anywhere along that continuum.
Well, and as you mentioned, I was just thinking to myself as you were talking about that, I'm like, we really did step into the deep end of the pool. When we first started playing, we didn't use, and not because we disliked, it's just our nature, like you said, we didn't use any pre-written adventures or anything like that. We immediately had to stretch our creativity and go right to, whether it was, like you said, a middle ground, and I would argue in some ways mine's a little bit of a middle ground because I pillaged from Forgotten Realms. But you know what I mean?
But definitely, but you created, like you told me with Session Zero, this is my own world. This is your own world. It's D&D, it's adjacent, but you got to give yourself credit for that because it truly is its own canon.
But the funny thing is I'm curious to know, this is more of a rhetorical question for our 5 listeners. Or is it 6? I can't remember. Instead of, when we decided to play it, instead of grabbing one of the adventures and the player's handbook and figuring it out, I spent days writing this writing this material
Uh-huh.
for us to play. And I've only scratched the surface. I figure I'm going to bore people to death if I go into the real deep parts of this, but I've written this in a way that we could play this for a long, long time. And your theme that you came up with regarding faith and droids, spiritualism, religion, that can be played in so many different. What are you clicking? Are you looking at something, or are you going to buy?
It's no, I'm not buying anything. Sorry for that, everyone.
No,
It's
okay.
very related to what we're talking about, but I'm not going to say anything about it just yet.
Okay.
I'm just doing. It's a mental note.
I broke the fifth wall by asking what you were clicking on when we.
Yeah,
were,
you did. It's I wasn't buying anything. I swear.
Okay.
It was a free PDF.
I know. Okay, but it's we chose probably a more complex path as new players.
It's story of our lives, my friend. There is no part of either of our lives where we've gone, oh, the simple direct path, I shall do that.
Yeah, I mean, when we went to buy the books, even when we were looking at Pathfinder, I didn't go out and grab one of the adventure paths or anything. When we went and had you pick up I picked up the core rule book, when you picked up the core rule book,
right,
it was all start from scratch.
no
we're getting
oh my God, yeah.
The question that I pose, just because you have some background in it, and I'm putting you on the spot, I think it takes time to answer, is so in my case, everyone's going to be different.
Yep.
In my case, me wanting to do that versus using a pre-built adventure or adventure path, is it a control issue on my part? I believe for me, I like to stretch my creativity, one, but two, it allows me and gives me control that I didn't necessarily feel as someone who was new had in a pre-built adventure. On the flip side, it would have been a heck of a lot easier.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't have been as fun. This is where we go back to world building. For us, writing the background, writing the appendices is as fun as writing the adventure itself.
Yeah, Brad, I think probably for many of us, certainly for you and definitely for me, it probably is at least in part a control issue. If we're honest with ourselves, for whatever reason, I'm reminded of the brilliant old SNL commercial of Macintosh Jr., the power to crush the other kids.
Yeah, the other kids.
Just wonderful. Yes. Yeah, the other kids. But because it's a control issue, and because of ours and especially your passions for computers. But that said, I also remember you talking about your thoughts and your feelings of creating a world. When you had pushed me to get into Pathfinder, and I finally relented and said yes, and we started playing, and it's like, okay, this is great. And then we ended up going to Star Wars. This was several years ago now. We ended up going to Star Wars, and then you pushed for D&D, and you're like, and basically you were seeking a balance of crunchiness in the game mechanic, and you convinced me, like, just get the player's handbook, try it out, read through it, let's play a session. If you don't like it, we'll do something else. And like we've talked about, I mean, good on you, because I was hooked, right?
We were hooked,
just loved it. But I remember after that, you talking about how you wanted to get into it, you wanted to GM. I thought that was great. But you were adamant from the beginning that you wanted to create your world. I remember talking about it with you, and you were really clear, like, you have a ton of stuff you want to use. There's all this D&D canon, but you didn't. I think you almost wanted to check out, is it okay if we homebrew? We don't do something already written. And I'm like, I mean, come on, go for it, right?
Yeah.
But you were adamant in your desire of wanting to do that. And so a long answer to a tough question, like you said, is there a control aspect, a control issue aspect? Maybe, probably. But I think I remember how excited you looked at the chance to be freely creative.
And that's something, and you, I think, stretch your abilities there more than I do. just in terms of, you will sit down and do creative writing. You will actually do it at, like you did with Ohm. And so on. And I know what you're going to say.
They were experiments to try to be a better writer in general.
Yeah, but still, you took that as an opportunity to grow and stretch yourself, right?
Yes.
So
yeah,
for
me,
I think
you were doing the same thing.
That's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
And the one thing I will say is the richest environment. You've heard me mention this series and all that before. The richest environment for me that really resonated was the original Dragonlance series, with this idea where there was a faith component to it, there was a high fantasy component to it, there was a magic component to it, there was, with Cameron and Wrestling were two twins as different as they could be. It was just such a rich environment, and not that others aren't. It's just, that's the one that resonated with me, and I wanted to build something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I did copy some, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
We're not publishing this for the world to see. I'd have to go through and get a whole bunch of copyright sign-offs. But the point is, you took an interest that you've had for a long time, and turn that into a great undercurrent and a great world to build. And it isn't a physical world either. It's the culture, it's the beings. Right. For me, I did the same thing because it was something I was interested in. There's areas that are in the game that you haven't experienced yet that touch on, I'll give a little bit away because I'm notorious for it, that touch on music and things that are of interest to me. It's funny how we do that. So for those that are expert DMs or regular DMs, are you homebrewing, and what are your inspirations? Who is your muse, or what are your inspirations for doing it?
And if you aren't used to world building, I think we can both readily see this can be very off-putting. If you're a newer GM, or just world building isn't your thing, it's one thing to create a character. And I mean, at some point we will have an episode where we play with character creation, because that can be a heck of a lot of fun. I mean, we were, who was that? That was Ben we were talking to, wasn't it? In fact, I think part of that was off air. We were talking, it's like, well, I gotta go change the wizard I built and haven't even played yet. Oh no, it was one of our upcoming interviews. And it got onto some multi-classing, and you almost might say multi-racing. And we were not going to say any more about that, but my God, people, we have a couple months worth of interviews that are going to just blow your D&D, Star Wars, everything else socks off. We'll say more about that later, but it got me thinking, okay, I want to go back and build characters, but that's a different process, I think, than world building. And the reality is, you and I geek out a lot about world building, both extrapolating within the worlds we love in canons, and building either within those worlds or building our own worlds like you did. And I think it's okay, Brad, if we drop a little hint here. Not going to say anything concrete. You know where I'm going to go with this. Not going to say anything concrete right now, but we have teased for a long time. Well, okay, so like a year ago, or almost a year ago, because it's still August, but almost a year ago, when we were having our initial episodes and those world building episodes on our own and with Rob, we were talking a ton about the Star Trek game we were working on. And then of course we met Jim Johnson, and it's like, oh well, this is a complete waste of time because they've already done it so beautifully. And every time we talk to him or read anything more, it's like, oh yeah, check. But
once we realized that the 2D20 system does everything that we want to and more
and better,
it seemed like there was no point.
No, but because we can world build so readily, the two of us in Trek. But you and I never lost the interest to create at that level. And you and I have been talking a lot lately about world building and wanting to do some, dare I say it, writing around it. So this isn't ready for prime time, everyone. So we're going to be cryptic and provide this teaser here, and we might not mention it for another month or two. Don't be surprised if you don't hear about it in future episodes. But a little teaser, because we will occasionally drop something on Twitter. All we're going to say is we have designs. We have designs in the work, and I think in the coming few months, we're going to take our time, just like we spent 6 months talking about and planning the podcast before we ever recorded our first episode. We have a lot of work to do, but at some point, probably definitely prior to 2023, I think, right around that transition, I think, don't be surprised if we start talking about one or more things that will involve drive-through RPG.
We are doing our absolute best to find things to do related to RPGs outside of the podcast that have nothing to do with playing RPGs.
We're really good at not playing right now.
Yeah, we are really
good at playing.
Because you and I had, and I've been a little under the weather this week, but so you have been, you've been the more, this seems to be a recurring theme these days as I recover from some things, but active on Twitter, and then some of this other stuff we're talking about. There are things that we are working on seriously, whether they pan out or not. Boy, I'm really over that. That step outside the bounds of podcasting, but stay within the worlds of RPG. Yet we are adamantly indirectly avoiding any way of playing right now. So anyone out there who has a game that they need 2 people, let us know.
Seriously.
Because we, at this point, we'd love to just play in a game rather than.
I was just going to say that, just if anyone's out there who needs some infrequent people, Brad's a great bard, let me tell you.
Oh, that was fun. Yeah. Well, that was all because of what is it? I can't remember.
Scanlan?
VoxMac.
Yeah, Brad's got his own take on Scanlan.
Oh, I was obsessed with him. I thought he was a riot.
Oh,
that character is an absolute riot.
Can't wait until the second season.
Yes. Hey, so we could ramble on this for hours, but I wanted to find out. Let's skedaddle over to the GM corner. So you did tease before the show that you already kind of knew what you were going to talk about. Yeah. So, and you wouldn't talk about it until now. So this is going to be as fresh to me as anyone. So what is it?
Well, it's not something. It's not a discussion. I just want to bring something to your attention and just put this out there for all of our listeners. I have been watching some specific numbers for our podcast over the past year. And this has been inconsistent in the specifics, but the trend has been slowly positive. And so I just want to call this out. It seems that every month or every few months, we are gathering a small but increasing number of listeners from around the world. And I think that's super, super cool. Just in the past month, as we record, we've had listeners from Canada. Not the most shocking. It's only it's like a 6-hour drive from my house, right? We've had Canada. I was going to say something politically inappropriate but funny, but I won't.
Well, there's a for all our Canadian friends, this is inappropriate, but someone wore a shirt from Canada when I worked with them. It had Canada and the US on a map, and it said Canada, America's hat since 1867.
There you go. Yeah.
And I've been trying to find that shirt,
That's
and
great.
I cannot find it. But go ahead.
So we've had listeners just in the past month from Canada, but also, listen to this, Brad: the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Russia, Taiwan, Australia, Germany. I don't think we can express how cool we think that is.
Oh yeah.
And how much we appreciate that. And especially in 2022, with all of the stuff going on, I don't know if there is anything more important than finding interests and activities that transcend political, national, and cultural boundaries. And so I've just for a while been wanting to extend a special thanks to all of you out there who tune into Dice and Mind, who are not located here in the States. Even if you're from the States, that's okay. We really appreciate the fact that you are listening, and we love the fact, and take it really seriously, that there are people increasingly around the world who are joining us and joining all of you in this little endeavor of ours. That's yet another wonderful example of the uniting and enjoyable powers of tabletop role-playing games. So that's my little thing. It's not something I've been working on, but it's something I've been watching for a while.
I'm going to append to that briefly, and then we can wrap it up. I don't think there's any need to talk about what we've been doing, because something our theme, you're the one that turned me on to, ironically. I was resistant to it just because I wasn't a big fan of narrative or talk radio. You finally, after years.
What did you start listening to?
NPR, a couple of years ago.
Okay, that's good.
A couple of years ago. So this has been a while.
Okay.
This has been a while. So one of the themes when you and I started coming up with this was having just kind of like a same similar type of vibe to it. Still have it as audio only, which is what we wanted.
Thoughtful and pedantic.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So as Robin Williams would say, absurd yet flaccid. Well, I've just made that explicit.
I've asked your wife, you haven't. Go on.
Okay. Well, you're gonna have to cut that out.
Nope.
Wow,
it hurts because it's true.
I know. I do. No. So
our
theme, we have kind of had it. We've kind of wanted this theme that way. We've kind of wanted a kind of a feel to it where it was light yet not, but simple in its approach. Audio only. Yep. Discussion, debate, open, bringing in other people with different belief systems.
Thoughtful but fun.
Yes. And so we both knew that might not necessarily attract a humongous audience because we have a very simple approach to what we believe to be a very complex ecosystem and content. And the fact that we've been doing this now for, I think you've mapped out officially through 70 episodes. We're going to keep going. It's not stopping, but just looking at our tracking document that you maintain, we're 70 episodes into this. We have people that are still tuning in and listening. We have people who are very interested in coming on and discussing the topics on the show. We are very lucky. Yeah. We are very lucky. I truly believe that we would not necessarily get, and it's not like we're a top 5 podcast, but we have some traction amongst people who actually are interested. And with our format, which doesn't always lend itself to being, EDM club exciting flashiness.
There it is.
So, I think you and I talk about this all the time. It's why we have some interest in some of these other things that we're doing outside of the podcast. This has been a catalyst for us. And while we're a small speck in a very, very bright sky of stars, we're just really happy that we're a speck that people see.
Yeah. I think that's totally true. And so, on that note, as we wrap up here, we have yet more interesting people with whom we're going to be talking in the coming couple months. We're going to, just the lineup, the next handful of interviews, Brad and everyone. You and I have been talking and recording with some fascinating, diverse divergently thinking and living people. And then, in all honesty, so that you can all prepare yourselves, you won't be surprised, but you can prepare yourselves, we're going to do a bit of a deep dive for a while around Star Trek. Not so much because we want to talk Star Trek, which we always do, but because a number of the people with whom we will be chatting are deeply immersed professionally or adjacently in Star Trek. And then we'll climb back out of that, and we'll talk to yet more interesting people. So as always, stay tuned. Lots more discussions coming. Eventually we'll have a session on character creation.
We might have more than one, because I think there's there's a lot of cool podcasts out there. I think Ben talked about his and so on. That it would be interesting to see two noobs go through the character creation process with just a couple different games.
Those might be a bit irreverent as well, I have to say. You and I, when it comes to character creation, let's just say we get a little silly.
Oh yeah, good call.
Yes. Well, I'll leave you with this. So I was listening to Dragon Talk the other day while I was on the bike on the stationary, and Shelley Mazanoble, wonderful, lovely person, was talking about
our first interview.
Thank you, Shelley. We can't wait for you, and hopefully you and Greg to come back when the book comes out. So cool. She was talking about playing a gelatinous cube as a PC. And I'm like, yeah, that resonates.
Yeah, I really would love to do that. But now that you've mentioned that, and with some of the upcoming episodes we have, I think we're going to be able to create some really fascinating and interesting and honestly humor driven, to keep it light, characters, just because of, well, I'll leave it at that.
Yep. All right. On that confused note of our synaptic meanderings, thank you as all for being with us. Thank you especially again to those of you who are overseas from us in this little, increasingly sometimes wayward country. Be well, stay well. We will see you all next week.